Today we've got a wide variety of experiences we want to share with you today. What this is about is a kind of a group of purpose-built executives that have volunteered to be part of the first cohort of equity ambassadors. And so what is that? Well, you may have heard that, as you can imagine, in our work, equity is clearly a key piece and a theme of how we want to do our work. But surprisingly, it had never been explicitly outlined in a way that everybody could really agree upon and everybody could really point to understand what that means and how we go about doing that. And so about a year and a half ago, there's a call out to executives who wanted to be a part of the first equity ambassador group to work with a national organization called Race Forward, which is really leading the way in terms of conversations around equity and race and across the country. And so we were asked to really begin to help hone and understand how we can advance this conversation forward, because it's not easy. And I hope that today will, through the next hour, you'll get a better glimpse of how we're trying to go about doing that. But for me personally, this work really, that when asked to be a part of that group, it really hit home. Because as I look around, much like you heard from one of my colleagues, Kia, for the past 22 years, I and my wife and family have chose to live in the neighborhood that we've worked in, and have chose to invest our kids in the neighborhood there. And as a result of that, don't have the luxury of not going home and looking at my neighbor in the eye and saying, hey, you weren't included. Or by the way, this was just for those folks. And so when we think about equity, when we think about our work, it's important that we lead with that and we understand what that means, and we begin to roll our sleeves up to do the hard work that it's going to take to ensure that everybody is included in the growth that we want to see. So with that, we're going to start start with an activity. It's called Lay It on the Line, and I think I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Danny, who's going to lead it. There you are. Thank you, sir. Lead us through that, and then following Lay It on the Line, we're going to have another handful of our colleagues on the that's in the Equity Ambassadors walk through a panel and kind of discuss some of their experiences thus far, and then we'll wrap up with a time of questions and answers.
I'm Danny Shoy, President and CEO of the Eastlake Foundation. So as my colleague Kirk mentioned, we're going to engage you in a short activity that's called Laying It on the Line. And we apologize in advance that everybody in the room can't do it. It's a lot of fun. But there were 50 of you that we asked to participate and help us out. So I'm going to ask at this time for the 50 of you to come up.
Woohoo!
Give them a round of applause. Yeah. 50. And if I can just, for a moment, I'm just going to ask all of you to stand here in a single row. Single row as much as we can stretch the row. And so I'm going to give you very simple instructions for all of you that are standing. And thank you again for volunteering. I know you don't exactly know what you're in for. So this is called, say it again. What did he say? Okay. So this is called Laying It on the Line. And you see two statements on the wall. On this side, to my right, strongly agree. On this side, to my left, so for everybody sitting, my left, your right, strongly disagree. And in a moment, my colleagues and I are going to read a series of statements. We cannot explain, we can't define. You have to interpret the statement however you interpret it. So that's kind code word for you to know not to ask me to explain the statement. But I'm happy to repeat it if you miss it, and there are no right or wrong answers, all right? And if everyone up here is fine to stand for about the next 20 minutes or so, everyone fine to stand? All right, and we're going to move around a little bit. So everyone got it? All right. So the first statement will come up on the screen. Success in America is contingent on how hard one works. Success in America is contingent on how hard one works. So since this is the first statement, if you strongly agree, you will move to that side of the room. If you strongly disagree, hold on one sec, don't move yet. Have some excited people. If you strongly disagree, you will move to that side of the room. And as you can imagine, if you fall somewhere along the continuum toward the center, this is the center. So I'll read it one more time. Success in America is contingent on how hard one works. You may move to where these statements strike you.
So this is a tough crowd to say, too. Right. Nobody's going to go out there.
All right. So I think we're going to establish that this is probably somewhere about the middle, more or less. All right. So why don't we start here? Remember, there are no right or wrong answers, so this is not about attacking anybody. For those of you that strongly agree, can I have anyone volunteer to share why you strongly agree? I'm going to move out so people can see and hear you. Oh, sorry, you're right. All right. So, all right, you got it. They're right. So no one who strongly agreed. Can they not hear me with the? Oh, all right. So you don't strongly agree, but you somewhat agree because you're a little bit this way of center, or you might be center. I'm learning with this group. But anyone want to share your thought about the statement? Shannon.
I would say I agree to a certain extent. Hard work does contribute. However, resources and opportunities aren't always available to those who do the hard work, so they can be easily overlooked. Doesn't mean they're not working hard. The opportunities aren't available.
Right. James?
In addition to that, no matter what the circumstances are, whatever your path, there are going to be challenges. And if you're not willing to work hard enough to overcome those challenges, what they may be, you won't find yourself as successful.
Thank you, James.
That's a moderate agreement. It's not a...
Not a strongly agree. You're right. Right, so I'm going to move right about here. This is the time when all the faces turn away because they don't want you to call on them. Anybody here want to share? Gregory?
My uncle always said it's better to be lucky than smart. And that, I think, captures a lot of how opportunities really manifest themselves.
Anyone else? I'm moving along the continuum. Ruth?
I think the problem with it being contingent on hard work assumes everyone is on a level playing field.
Did everyone hear Ruth? All right. And how about I'm going to move down here to the strongly, this is the strongly disagree, right?
I think we heard earlier that your zip code defines where you are and what your future can be.
Right. Anybody? Anybody else?
Success in my zip code may just be surviving, and that's not even success in America. So success for me just may be making it through the next day.
So what we heard, thank you all for participating, and stay where you are for a moment. So what we heard were a few things. Not everyone starts in the same place. It depends on opportunities and resources. That the word success, as Mark mentioned, success was an operative word for him, and how do you define success? So in this statement, this is based on a meritocracy. And we know that based on bad policies and practices, discriminatory practices and policies, that for some people, no matter how hard they work, they might not realize success. And as Mark said here, success, how do you define success? Is success defined by socioeconomic status and well-being? What does that mean? And in the communities where we live, in the communities where we work that are racialized, we see an abundance of inequity along race, along gender, a number of things. But yet these are communities that all have the ability to be very vibrant. So what we know, and I'm glad that all of you, I hope, will join us for dinner for Richard Rothstein's session to hear more about bad policies and practices, racist policies and practices, that we know that oftentimes when systems work in this country, they're more inclined to work for people who are white than for people of color. So I'm actually going to pass this to Kirk, who's going to move us through the second statement. So after Kirk reads the second statement, for all of you that are standing, you can move according to the continuum.
Thank you, Danny. So the next statement, neighborhood growth and development is a good thing. So strongly agree, strongly disagree. Wow, pretty interesting shift. So I'm going to start on this end and see kind of hear your comments. So on this end of strongly disagree, neighborhood growth and development is a good thing. Any volunteers? One?
So, Jeffrey. So I stood here, but I was kind of in the middle. I believe neighborhood growth and development definitely can be a good thing, but if we're not careful that we have the growth coming from outside in, and at times it can push those who grew up in that neighborhood, it can push them out of the same neighborhood that they grew up in, where they can't afford the neighborhood at times.
Thank you. I hear.
over here.
I'm sorry.
He belongs over here.
Okay. Yes.
I believe the bottom line is the hidden agenda. So what's the true intention for the growth? So if the intention is to marginalize or to gentrify a neighborhood, then it's not good. And what are the resources that are coming into the neighborhood for growth? So definitely intention.
Thank you, Wanda. Thank you. So going a little bit further down here, Kendra.
I feel like if I could ask questions, I would move this way. But I stood here because I didn't see anything about stabilization. You can't grow and develop something that's already unstable. And I think someone also made the comment today, if you really ask someone about what they like in their neighborhood or what they want to happen, some folks might tell you they're already there. And so, you know, I think that's a relative statement that needs some questions.
Thank you so much. Go on. John?
I would just add, for whom? Neighborhood growth and development is a good thing for who? For who?
Thank you.
I think everybody deserves a thriving and healthy neighborhood, as long as it's not at the expense of those who have lived in that neighborhood for a very long time. So growth, I think, is good without displacement, and with helping those who have been the foundation of the neighborhood.
Go a little bit further down here on this end. Anyone? Anyone? Come on, come on. Yeah?
I think neighborhood growth and development is good if you take into account the needs of all of those who are in the community and not a certain segment of the community, or that you're trying to pull in a certain group and exclude another group.
I'm hearing a very common theme here. Go on this end. One of you.
So if we take it on a basic level without asking questions, growth provides opportunity. So that's why I'm on this side. Strongly agree that it provides that opportunity, regardless of whether it's for who or not, but it's providing an opportunity for that neighborhood.
I'd say that growth and development is a great thing, and the reason I say that is because I'm a witness to that. Had I not been engaged, and my family and I, at the table from the very beginning, because one of the things that we come across when we're doing redevelopment is people stand from a distance and go by hearsay. They don't get involved. They're not at the table. They don't attend meetings. They don't get to know who's coming, understand the motives. But growing up in East Lake, we were partners from the very beginning at the table, making decisions, and you can't be heard if you're not willing to get to the table, get involved of the process, and not allow someone to come in your neighborhood and develop without you not taking opportunities when there are town hall meetings, get to know the developers, get to know the partners, get to know the school system, get to know everyone who has an investment in the neighborhood. The development can go off, and it's not always an easy process. It's a process that takes time. But if the motives are there, the initiatives are there, and the efforts are there, it can be a great thing. Growing up in East Lake, it took me one ride 60 miles to go get an education from East Lake to Buckhead. And that's 60 miles one way every day. In those 60 miles, I got to see how different neighborhoods thrive. And some people may laugh that grass is not a necessity, but it was a dream for me to see grass and to see horses and to see mansions and to see how the other half lived. So we were partners at the table, making the decision so that the next families didn't have to drive 60 miles to get those opportunities. They could walk. In East Lake today, you can walk to the health facilities, to the banks, to the grocery stores, to the school, to the YMCA. So inclusion, not exclusion, makes the biggest difference. And if someone's coming to your front yard, get included so you can't be at a distance and at a disadvantage.
Thank you. Thank you. So real quickly, I'm going to add a real quick question, and we won't belabor this point. So of all those on the stage, or excuse me, up front here, having heard something that one of your colleagues has shared, think about it, would you change your position? And if so, go for it. Any others? Excuse me, either more disagree or more strongly agree.
Yeah, because I'm really bad at following directions. So when you said be over here, I thought I was supposed to be on this side. So I really wanted, but I didn't want to interrupt when you started asking questions. Then after hearing her, I'm like, we can all just leave the room right now. So I'm good with her.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I wanted to highlight a couple of themes that I heard. One was for whom, right? For who it matters. And then the second one is kind of, to a certain degree, defining what is good. What does good mean, right? What do we mean by that? And of course, this exercise intentionally doesn't allow you to ask those questions. It tries to highlight some of the assumptions that you're bringing to the table for you to make that decision so that we can kind of highlight those differences. So with that, I'm handing it over to Kia to lead us in our third and last question.
All right. Only one more time for y'all to move around. So the third statement is, I believe we can end racial inequity. Strongly disagree, strongly agree. I believe we can end racial inequity.
I'm just moving out the way.
Hey. All right, Jeffrey.
Yeah, same one.
Tell us why you're standing up.
Same one.
It's been going on so long, but see, I still but strongly disagree. I think we have to want to. Honestly, if we ever get to a point where everyone wants to end it, let me back up. Before we can end it, we have to acknowledge it. And so I think if we can get to a point where everyone acknowledges that there are mentality issues, there are racial issues, there's white privilege, there's all of this. If we can acknowledge it, then I think we definitely can get to a point where we can end it in this generation. And so now we're not perpetuating the cycle. We're not teaching it to our children, and they're not teaching it to their children. But first we have to acknowledge before we can end anything.
About someone over here. Buddy?
I think Jeffrey made a lot of good points about acknowledging some of the disparities, but just thinking back on my life, I was raised by my grandparents, who would probably be 95 to 100 years old if they were still alive. And I think the question or the statement that you made about being taught generationally about treatment and things along those lines, but if they were still here, I'm not sure if the country or the situations are much more different than when they were young. And that's a sad state to be in some 80, 90 years later, 3, 4, 5 generations later. And so for me and my family moving forward, would it take 5 generations to unteach a lot of things that have been going on for so long, I wouldn't be around to see it. My kids, grandkids, great-grandkids will probably endure a lot of the same treatments, disparities, regardless of education, regardless if what, from the last speaker, if you live in a one zip code, if you go 5 miles away, your life expectancy could be 20 years difference. So I don't want to be all the way to that side of the room, but it's hard for me to move over to the strongly agree section.
I don't think we'll ever end it. I probably should have stood all the way over there. Because as long as you have human nature, and as long as we have people trying to figure out being fair, so what I feel that is making me successful or what I feel that's making me move forward, it's not going to be always the same. So as long as human nature is involved, you're never going to end. Will we come close? Will we get somewhere? Yes, but it will never end.
I'm kind of in the middle here because I'm an optimist, also a realist. Accountability, responsibility, respectability, boundaries, acknowledgement. There's no way we can go back and make up. And I think a lot of people look for people to go back and make up for something that happened. And as America, for us collectively to kind of meet halfway, there has to be acknowledgement like he stated, but there's no way we can expect people to go back and make up for what happened to our ancestors and before, but how do we start today from a conversation of everybody saying, okay, we understand this happened, where do we go from here? I'm not so sure if there's an answer about going from the past. My thing of it is we have children coming behind us that we as adults have a responsibility to not just say there is no end, because then we don't give them hope. I have to be optimistic that I can give my children hope, whether it happens or not. I can't cheat them to say what won't happen or what never will be. I have to give them that hope to keep fighting, like my grandmother fought for me, and I fight for my children. So to walk around defeated as though it will never change, are we still being a part of the problem, or are we still trying to find a solution? I'd like to find a solution because my children will be left behind, and it's not fair. There's never been an even playing field, but I can't make up for yesterday. How do I get them on an even playing field today? How can I get them benefits and resources today? So I'd like us to have some forward thinking of how can we not aim at so much as reverse, and even in our personal relationships and marriages, we can't stay married if we live on what our husband and wives did to us yesterday. If we're gonna reconcile, there has to be therapy, there has to be work put in, and there has to be forgiveness. I have 26 years in the game, so I know it. So what I'm saying is, I just think there is a possibility that there is some process that can take place. Conversations are happening, and they're very uncomfortable conversations, but I remember there weren't conversations. Plus, we have to take leadership. Leadership of America needs to take responsibility for their actions, because there's a lot of unnecessary influence that is taking us back to those dark places that they just won't let us forget that.
I don't think racial inequity can ever end unless we address class inequity. And I think that class hides behind the camouflage of race a lot of times, and you can't really affect change unless you, as somebody who's a part of a higher class, admits that there is patterns that exist because of that extend into race. And so that has to be a part of the conversation as well. If every minority became rich, there wouldn't be a lot of inequity around there, but there would still be inequity based on class.
I agree that we have to have hope and promise, and that's why I'm here in the middle, because I know that it would not be fair to my children if I did not. I don't agree that it will be in my lifetime. It will probably not be in theirs or their children's. My father, who is still living, and I had a conversation just on yesterday, and he talked about white and black water fountains. I mean, that's a part of him. So we're just not that far away from slavery and segregation and civil rights, especially not here in the South. So it really has to take time for that to happen. I think as we become more diverse, I think as we start to really have those conversations, that we are taking the steps toward that, but not in my lifetime, unfortunately.
I'm leaning a little towards strongly agree as an educator for 16 years. And while I do agree that we may not be able to go back and change the past, I think we can look back and make sure the stories are told the right way. Because once we start finding out things about technology and innovation, we start to find out that we've been part of that all along. We just haven't gotten the credit that we've deserved. And so I realized that might not change the damage that's occurred, but if people can get the credit that they're owed, then it would help open up that narrative to see that we've been contributing to this all along. And then trying to be more forward-looking about it. As an educator, if I didn't believe there was at least a distant chance we could possibly end up landing there, then I would feel like a lot of my time, our time, a lot of people's time who've been dedicated to education and equity and making things better. I know it sounds altruistic, but if we're not aiming for that best possible outcome, then what are we aiming for? So, and I think that does have to take the shape of some uncomfortable conversations with friends and family. I'm a prior service member. I'm sure we have other prior service members here. And the climate from a few years ago till now has probably really challenged some of the relationships we've had. You talk to your old veterans, you talk to your old friends, and sometimes there's the painful realization they really only saw the version of you they wanted to see. And with the tone and the rhetoric that's been thrown out there right now, I think some of us have had some very difficult conversations with people we used to consider brothers and sisters.
Thank you. All right, in 30 seconds or less, I need somebody on the strongly agree side.
I think I attempted, like my colleagues, to exegete the statement. I believe in hope. I believe in the possibility of human beings to change. And I also believe that if private actions and public policies created certain conditions, that we can flip that and create new conditions.
Thank you. So I heard a couple of different things as I walked down this line. One of the things that I heard was time, right? Maybe it could happen, but we won't see it in my lifetime. It'll take 5 generations, etc., right? So that's something to consider. And then I'm going to reread the statement. I believe we can end racial inequity. I believe we can end racial inequity, right? And so I heard lots of examples of the practices and the activities and the conversations and the policies that need to change in order to make can a possibility. But what I also hope y'all take away from this is that y'all were standing at all different ends of the spectrum. But really, most of us were saying the same thing, right? And so when we think about how we interact with people, when we have those courageous and hard and challenging conversations, try to remember that we can really be thinking the same thing. We just have a different approach or a different way to explain it, right? All right, I think that's my time.
So just very quickly, we talked a little bit at the very beginning of why we started the program, but there are actually 3 objectives. And if you were at the conference last year, we talked a little bit about these in our closing session. The first thing that we asked the equity ambassadors to do is to develop and customize a racial equity one-on-one workshop. The exercise that you saw is one of the things that's in that workshop, and it is designed to be able to come out to our communities to engage partners and board members and staff in a way of what we call normalizing. Normalizing and understanding our history, understanding about redline and some of the things that have brought some of the systemic issues in systemic institutional racism kinds of things that have happened, helping people understand that. Because, you know, if I took a show of hands here, many of you maybe understand some of those things. But a lot of people in communities that want to do the right thing and do this work don't have that understanding. So we have to level the playing field of understanding first, and we call that normalizing, and that's what objective 1 is. The second thing is you have to be able to actually put this into practice. And you're going to hear from 3 of our equity ambassadors on how they're doing some of those things based on being a part of our program. And so we are in the infancy, but really looking at how do we integrate tools and practices into the way that we coach as purpose-built staff and as we help you do your work over time. And then build network capacity, because the more we all understand this information, the more we are able to feel comfortable with not only understanding how to have conversation, but also have tools to be able to integrate this into the work, the better off we will be. So, and Race Forward has been our partner from the start. One of the things that the equity ambassadors really pushed us as purpose-built to be able to do is to think about a framework for our equity work. And our ambassadors said that what we needed to do was to develop a statement with some components that really help frame our work. And we're in that process. It hasn't been finalized yet. We're beginning to try it on and practice it. What we want to make sure that we do is before we do some grand announcement on the website, that we feel confident that we are really beginning to walk the talk. And so what I'm going to ask the 3 ambassadors that are on the stage to take an element of each of our equity statement and to be able to show how they're bringing it into being. And so our equity statement has 3 components. We want to be able to lead from within, because we know it starts with you having an understanding of your own biases. It's about leading together and thinking about how we can do this work together. And it is for naught, as you all have talked about, if we don't also have outcomes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tammie.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here today. Again, project manager for Spartanburg, South Carolina's Northside Development Group, and I see some of my colleagues in the audience. And I have some notes, because if you don't know Michelle, she's very adamant about keeping us on track, and I tend to go on and on and on. And when we're talking about from leading from within and actually acknowledging, and I'm thankful that Jeffrey mentioned that, it's about understanding where you individually come from first before you can actually think about externally implementing. And so for me, I wanted to share some personal stories and then share with you some things that I learned through the Race Equity Ambassador Program. I was born a single mother. I never met my father. I grew up in the southeast side of Chicago, surrounded by the most diverse neighborhoods you can imagine in America. Growing up in public housing, living on welfare, and seeing struggles of my mother, I wanted a better life for myself, and I wanted a calling towards justice and equity at a very young age. I used to never tell this story about my life. I was a private person, maybe a little embarrassed, as some of us may be. Yet I recognized the power of telling my story by leading from within. I consider myself a liberal Democrat. Any of you that know me know that. And I found myself in the South going to college, in many cases, having many arguments with my very conservative colleagues. No hard feelings of those of you in the audience. But it was about government entitlements. It was about handouts. It was about welfare and SNAP and public housing and how all these things were entitlements and government handouts. And I would say to them, what are you talking about? That's me. All of those programs gave me an opportunity to be successful. And they say, you? And I said, yeah, me. And then it hit me. Why were they astonished? Why were they surprised? Was it because I was successful and I had a master's degree? Or was it because I was white? They had an implicit and maybe an explicit bias of who gets access to these entitlements and who deserves them and who needs them. And it could be somebody like me, but maybe they thought it couldn't. I may not have grown up with privilege, but I grew up with white advantage. My second grade teacher was a huge influence in my life. When I didn't show up for school on time, when my grades slipped slightly, he paid special attention to me. And I think about what a great man he was and how he saved my life. But now in this context, in this work, I wonder, would he have treated me differently if I was a young girl of color? My 16-year-old daughter, a sweet little white blonde girl, saw me reading a book about white privilege recently. And she told me a story about being in middle school and about how it was forbidden to sit on the desks. She often did it. She never got called out for it. Well, her friend, African-American girl, always got in trouble. She now knows about equity. So in the work that we've been doing here, we've been talking about leading from within, and part of that is about being able to have your personal experiences. What are your experiences? What are you exposed to? How can you expand those experiences? Your awareness. Be cognizant of racism, implicit and explicit, and be okay with addressing it. How does it play out in your life, and how are you activating yourself around it? Help others to be aware, like I did with some of the colleagues that would have those arguments with me. And have an open dialogue about race. Be able to share and be able to receive. And educate yourself. I can't tell you how many books and podcasts and movies and things that I've been exposed to just in this program alone when I thought that I knew history and I thought that I knew how I would approach it. But be brave. Your voice matters. For me, it was being open and honest, and many of my colleagues in the ambassador program said, own your whiteness, Tammie. Own who you are. And ultimately, I learned how to do that and take that advantage to the cause so I can link arm in arm with my colleagues and my friends of color towards a different future. And so this is what the race and equity has meant to me personally.
One day I'm going to sit up here and I'm not going to tear up as I'm listening to my colleagues share from their heart. And I think that's one of the things that I've loved about this program is each of them have been willing to lean into exploring personally, but then also looking at what it means for their leadership. And so, again, we are using the frame of our equity statement. And so our first component is lead from within, that Tammie has shared. And our second is lead together. And Ann Whitlock out of Houston, Connect Communities, is going to share a little bit about her perspective there.
Well, welcome everybody. I want to pick up on what Tammie said, because for all of us, we experienced a strand of what Tammie just talked to you about. And so my learning journey was, I'm working in a very, is it not working? No. Okay, so my neighborhood that in Houston is very, it's predominantly Latino, and it is predominantly refugee and new immigrants. So it's a little bit different. But for me, it was really trying to take that learning journey and then figuring out how do we know and value each other and address equity in this neighborhood within my staff, within the board, and within our partners. And that's a tall order because everyone's kind of they're all running in different directions and got different focuses. So we really broke it down into 3 pillars. The first one is equity as a core value. So as an organization, equity is front and center in what we say publicly and how we show up at events, et cetera, in our work. And so one of the things that we actually did as a team just last month, we hosted the second Racial Equity Ambassador Workshop for our staff, board, and partners. And it was an all-day event, and I think, again, brings up some tough conversations, but it also serves to really open people's eyes. And I think, as one of the people said in the laying it on the line, we have to educate ourselves first before we can really understand the problem. And so we're really pushing this out. I'm glad to say that some of the activities that we've started already have now starting to trickle down to some of our programs and some of our partners. So that work will be ongoing as we seek to kind of build this awareness. The other thing is we state our values up on every document that we put out so that it's very clear where we're coming from in our work. I think the second thing is embrace diversity and elevate the voices of people most excluded. So how does this look in a neighborhood that shares no common culture, no common language, no common religion? So one of the things that we've done is create what's called a Community Connector Program. It's through our partnership with our FQHC partner. They got an AmeriCorps grant, and we are now hiring people from the neighborhood to be those deep connectors of like what's happening in the neighborhood with our work and vice versa. And so these people will help give us the ability to communicate, with 50 different languages in the neighborhood. That's one of our most critical challenges. And also to help understand where the tensions are just within intra-neighborhood dealings. We also did a really innovative program this summer. We're working to redesign a major artery of the neighborhood. It's an 8-lane, essentially a highway. It could have been a project just with Public Works and an engineering firm. What we were able to do was get the project to hire 7 high school interns who not only learned about the engineering design process, but the really cool thing was they use that street every single day to go to school, to go to work, to go to their apartments. And they were able to inform the project in a way that would have been completely missed if it had just been Public Works engineers and a private company. And I'd say the second thing that came out of that was really that all of a sudden these kids who use this street every day, it opened their eyes like, wow, we never realized that we could actually bring something to bear on the problem, and we could use our voice to make changes. And so it's really built their advocacy voice within the neighborhood, which is critical to any of our work, right? And then we really try to ensure that all of any media or neighborhood action is led by the community residents and students. So they go to city council meetings. They are the front and foremost for the media if there's something happening that we want the broader community to know about. And then I'd say the third thing is just equity as a daily practice. It's a muscle that we have to build, and it's just if you're not thinking about it every day, it can easily kind of fall to lower priority. So always asking ourselves, is the community voice represented? Is there diversity of opinions and viewpoints? Is equity showing up in our meetings and our practices and our policies? And one of the things that really has kind of been my aha moment is in the design of our buildings. I think one of the things that I'm sure we'll all encounter is pushing our partners to be more inclusive in how they think about building design and function. And I think if we start kind of moving people in that way, we'll get much better projects. So those are just a few of my thoughts, and I'm going to turn it over to Othello.
Yeah. But Anne, as she mentioned, has a little bit of a different community than some of our communities, it being immigrant and refugee. So this idea of really where's that community voice and overcoming some of the hurdles of language and some other things, having that equity lens, like you said, I get to go to Houston and support the work that they're doing there as one of the purpose-built staff, really is creating that energy within your neighborhood that could really be disconnected even though you're doing some of the physical infrastructure kinds of things. So it's really exciting to see some of the things that are happening there. And so last but certainly not least, we have Othello Meadows, and he's going to share from our equity statement a little bit about leading for outcomes. Because at the end of the day, if this conversation doesn't turn into outcomes, some of which leading together creates that, and from within, it's all for naught. So, Othello.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like the place where you sort of, many of us in the room are in these positions where we have access and can kind of direct resources in a way that is, I think, really unique and really powerful. And one of the things, the hardest thing I think in this work is, number one, to be aware of those opportunities at all times. And it's not enough to kind of see, for us, we'll use contracting as an example. So we built, I don't know, $60 million worth of buildings in the last 4 years or 3 years. And when you think about those opportunities, you know, if you are not every single day thinking about, well, how can I break this contract up to make it more accessible to minority contractors? How can I ease this bonding issue? Can we advance payroll? Can we issue zero interest loans? If you're not like constantly thinking about that and you don't have that at the top of mind, you know, and I really, if I'm self-critical, I think about the opportunities that slip past us because we weren't thinking about that. And you know, and you think you're aware, you think you are fighting that fight, but if it is not intentional, if it's not a part of your practice, when you look back, you will be saddened at how many opportunities to, especially financially empower people, to help grow small business that you allow to kind of slip through the cracks. So the first thing for us is really that awareness. Just, it is top of mind at our organization every single day. From our hiring, our office is, ironically, our office is not very diverse at all. There's me and 4 black women, and so, right, so it's one of these things. And you know, in this process, you know, lends itself to this other type of self-discovery, which is, you know, the women in my office, oftentimes black women are, I found in the nonprofit sector and in every other sector, the most downtrodden, the most forgotten, the most oppressed. And so if you have an opportunity as president and CEO and you are not addressing those things, those are kind of hollow titles, right? So in my own growth, in my own journey, as somebody who values equity and who values racial justice, that was a period of growth for me, because I won't lie and say that I came into that position understanding the plight that Sydney or Alexis or Kasha, who's here, goes through as a black woman in this industry, in this sector. But the second thing is, you know, having the courage to really pull the trigger. So when you have to go to funders and say, all right, our job is going to cost significantly more if we use contractors from this neighborhood or from the community, and have the courage to say, if we say that this is important, if we say that this is something that we value, you have to be willing to kind of go to the mat for that. And fortunately, we have the type of funders and the type of partners that didn't blink when we went and we said, look, we're going to use a minority HVAC company, but it's going to cost us significantly more, right, to bond those people, to float their payroll, to make sure that they have everything they need, to give them mobilization cash. Those are things that you don't think about. You know, it sounds good, inclusion and these things that we talk about so glowingly, but when you get to the meat of it and you actually have to say, how does this work? What we found is that if you are not courageous enough to say that in whatever room that you're in, right, then you don't necessarily really hold those values as closely as you think. So for us, the two things that I think of when I think about leading for outcomes is really being greedy with every opportunity, right, and being aware of every single chance to put money in the pocket of somebody from your community that you can. And you can't do that without always having that top of mind. And the second thing is, now that you've identified those opportunities, it is not as easy as just saying, I'm going to pick this person instead of this person, or this company instead of that company. It is now I have to solve for a very real financial problem. And in the contracting world, and maybe this isn't the case in other cities, but in many of the cities that are represented within the network, these mid-sized cities, they're not Atlanta, where you have this thriving contracting community or these other thriving communities of people who can come to the table ready to go from day one. When you're in a city like Omaha, when you're in a city like Grand Rapids, you're in a city like many other places within the network, the challenge is more real because it's going to cost you more money. And that is, I found, the way you measure somebody's commitment. If they're willing to spend money on it, I tend to think of their commitment as realer. So I don't know if that answers your...
I see heads nodding, so it seems like it resonates with the group. So our time is short, but I do want to have the opportunity for some questions, and I would just ask that Danny and Kurt, I think Kia, who had another, she actually had to get on a plane. She was so great to be able to come in today to do this session and the session before she had to leave. But I just would invite, and we can pass the mic up here if we need to do that, just to see if there is any questions, but to have all the ambassadors. And we probably have time for 2 or 3. So, go. None.
They want you to ask the questions.
Huh? Oh.
Afternoon. My question is for Othello, Omaha. I was curious about what relationship, if any, you have with the city and trying to help, because oftentimes the city will take a lead on working with small businesses, helping the process, helping small businesses who are maybe not familiar with what the whole process may look like and helping them get up to speed. And I don't know if you have a relationship with them or not, or what does that look like?
We are in a city that is, I don't know who's here, but I'll just say, who is hostile to race-conscious programming. Most of those kinds of programs and partnerships, in Omaha at least, and probably a lot of other pretty conservative cities, come out of the private sector. So we have great partners on that front, but the city does not take a lead, especially if it is race conscious.
One of the things I'd like to add to that, though, is about leading within and together, and the work that we've done is sometimes you're going to have to cultivate that opportunity. So I know in Spartanburg, we have been working with partners to actually create a construction training program to help folks get the skill sets that they need. We also offer a small business initiative in the neighborhood, specific to the neighborhood, because sometimes we have to build that capacity because it's not already there. As Othello was talking about, our city is about 38,000 people. So when you talk about minority businesses and opportunities, a lot of folks, we may be able to get minority businesses, but they're coming from Atlanta and Charlotte and other places. So if we're really talking about impacting our community, sometimes you have to build that capacity and be intentional, very intentional about it.
Other questions?
Thank you, Danny and Kurt. They're floating the mic. If any other questions?
I have one up here.
There's one up in the front. And then one right here. And that'll be the last question. Right here. That'll be our last question.
So I'm from Chicago, and we have worked, I think, very effectively with partners who've helped us hire from our communities as we develop. But one of the issues that we run into is with the trade unions, and that's difficult to navigate. So there's construction preparation programs, but then actually, that takes time in terms of really getting them through the unions and able to come that way. Anything that any of you have done?
So I'm in South Carolina where there are no unions, so we don't have that as a barrier necessarily, but we do look at our community college to get the national certified construction trade skill certification where that can be taken anywhere. So we do try to look at those accredited programs to get folks into. We also, within programs that we have, so we do an owner-occupied rehab program, we do some things internally. We offer any position at our organization or work that we're doing directly to anyone who's qualified within the community. So sometimes there are things in your own control that you may be able to manage a little bit better. Our residents have first option for any of our employment opportunities, and we want to build that capacity. So we don't have that same union barrier, but we do look at some of those other ways to address that.
I think you're raising a really good point. You know, we're talking about racial equity, and unions have a very, very, very mixed track record, especially in the trades when it comes to people of color. Omaha is not as heavily unionized as Chicago, but there's still a strong union presence, and that has not been fertile ground for us. We've had to kind of do programs similar to what Tammie mentioned in terms of just workarounds, right? How do we get people prepared in other ways?
And the problem that we run into is then when you call for your inspection, for your occupancy permit, if you're not working with union workers, you know, the inspectors can really come down hard on you. So it's just something that we all need to be aware of.
So that's a systemic issue we need to address.
So I'm going to take the last question, then I have an announcement, and then we will convene to the reception.
Yeah, so this is so great. So social conditioning, and I know that you all was talking about explicit and implicit bias. How long did it take you all as leaders to transition to use implicit bias as far as saying, you know what, thinking through the process and saying just transitioning between explicit and implicit?
So one thing I would say is it's a work in progress, and I'm not sure that any of us could honestly say that we never have bias. So, you know, I'm not sure what my colleagues and also Kurt and Danny might say, but I think it's always a work in progress.
I kind of think of it as like peeling an onion. You know, like you kind of peel the onion, you have your aha moments, and then you go a little deeper, and you start. I can't say it's a practice, and you have to be vigilant about it every day. So I would say I'm definitely still on this journey, and but I'm much more aware of it now. And
yeah.
Another piece of that question is asking, as a team, particularly if you have a diverse team, who the right person to deliver that message is, depending upon the audience, right? So I want to be really sensitive to the fact that we're not piling on conversations among our colleagues of color that, frankly, are conversations that white folks need to be leading the way on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that because I think it is a learning, right, and it's an opportunity, and I think if we're intentional about it, and I think that's the most important thing, is to have those open conversations. And I know our team, we do, and sometimes they're uncomfortable, and sometimes we're looking to address them, whether it be through program opportunities or just having open dialogue about it. But it is an ongoing process, and I think that's part of what this particular program has enabled us to do, is have a very safe space to have these conversations where I could talk to Othello about maybe something that happened, and he can share with me how maybe I should approach that as a white woman, and vice versa. And so that's been really the benefit of this particular opportunity, to kind of have that space to talk about how do we get past and move towards the future.
I think you got to keep just putting yourself in positions where you're not afraid to look stupid, you know what I mean? And just be open to, for me, working with all women has really helped me grow.
Your wife is happy?
I wasn't trying to be ironic there, but it's really helped me grow, because there were things that I just, until you're in these environments, I just feel like you don't know what your biases are, you know what I mean? And so by putting yourself out there in these positions where you're gonna, not look like the smartest dude sometimes, and just be okay with that, and I just had to kind of get comfortable with being in those situations where you might stub your toe, right, and have to apologize.
We love knocking him in the head.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
Michelle especially.
So before Michelle cuts us loose, I do want to say on behalf of the 7 of us, Michelle was very gracious to acknowledge the 7 executive directors who went through this journey over the past year, but I want to actually acknowledge Michelle Mathews, and Damon Bailey, and also the rest of the purpose-built community staff for taking this on seriously. And this is not, while the Equity Ambassadors is new, the commitment to racial equity is not new for purpose-built communities, and did not want for us to end the session without doing that.
Thank you. I do have one announcement. We hope that this has been helpful, and we hope that you see that in earnest we are doing something, not just talking about it, but we are actually putting program and infrastructure in place to hold ourselves accountable and to work on our equity framework. And so with that, I want to let you know that we are looking for our next cohort. So if you are in the Purpose-Built Network, and it still would be an executive director, we are looking to start our next cohort in 2020, and we will send that announcement out first thing on Monday. Our first cohort will be with you for some overlap to learn, to share some of their knowledge, to be a little bit of a mentor, but to help us further this program. And so if you're sitting in the audience and you're not an executive director of a purpose-built community, but you are connected to one, and you think that this would be something helpful for your executive director, then we would love to have a conversation with you about it. We really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to come to our session. And now it is the reception.
Cocktail.